Yeah, there's a lot of great books that I would always recommend that people read. So, another way of saying this is to me, self awareness is like the ultimate productivity hack. If you really understand yourself, then you know how to get the best out of yourself. But the problem is, we can't, or it's very difficult to figure out what motivates us from just like doing like the internal work. Sometimes we have to have an external person or some external resources or information to help us kind of discover what those things might be, right? So, for example, a really simple thing you could do is I'm sure everyone has taken a personality test at one point, whether it's Myers Briggs, DISC, Strength Finder. Like, there's all of these things, and then when you read them, you go, "Oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. Like, that's really me." Right. Even though you kind of knew it already, like you had to take an external test to really understand yourself. And that's my whole point, which is it's kind of like if you're like inside of a jar, you can't read the ingredients label, right? Because the ingredients label is on the outside, even though when you're inside of it, like that's you as a person, but you can't read it from the outside. And even though it's saying exactly what it's made of and who it is and what it is and so on. And so sometimes we need to be able to step outside and go, what is the ingredient label on me? Like, what am I made of? What do I believe in? And that's kind of difficult to do when you're on the inside. And so we need like external help sometimes, like a personality test, a coach, reading books so that you can kind of get a sense of what those labels might look like. And so I'd say those three things are probably the most influential. Personality tests, are so many of them. I would say whichever one you pick the one that resonates most with you, and then really study it. Because after a while, you start to notice most of them are kind of the same, because they kind of rely on the same brain tendencies and dopamine and hits. And so what you'll start to realize is if you just study one really well, then you'll have a good sense of like who you are as a person. And then you'll start to, go deeper into what are your values? What is important to you? How do you align with your time and your values at the same time? So for example, if your number one value is family, like, or family time, but your number one activity on your calendar, according to the time allocation, is working, like there's a misalignment there, right? Like if you're saying that family is so important to you, but you spend 90% of your time working at the office, like we're out of alignment there. Like ideally, what is most important to us is also what we spend most of our time and money on, right? So I can look at someone's calendar and credit card statement and be like, I can roughly figure out what your most important values are based on how you spent your time and how you spent your money. But if they don't align with what you think is most important, then we always end up with friction in our life, right? So, for example, I thought my number one value was family, but I spent most of my time working, and I always felt like something is off in my life. Like I'm, missing out on Thanksgiving. I'm missing out on all these holidays. I'm kind of upset about it, but at the same time, I was like, like.
Welcome to Learn or Be Learned. We either learn from others or others learn from us. The former is able to help us become a better, faster you. Follow me weekly as I dig up stories like a true anthropologist would on one of the three series called Guest Conversations, Book Applications, or My Small Talk Explorations. I'm your host, Shiva Danshaker, and let's talk. All right, welcome back, everybody. So I'm here with Dan, a very great person about productivity. He has his own podcast and he has his own company called Asian Efficiency, correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So Dan, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit further and tell the audience, about what you've been up to?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I started this company, Asian Efficiency, back in 2011, purely as a passion project. A few years earlier, I dropped out of college, which I think is like cardinal sin number one of any Asian kid to drop out of school. So my parents didn't talk to me for like 2.5 years because they were like, very upset about it, and they sacrificed so much to kind of give me a better opportunity. But they felt like I kind of squandered that opportunity when I decided to drop out of school. But I had this very unique opportunity to get this mentorship from this guy that I saw speak at a seminar, and I went up to him after the talk and I asked him out for lunch, and he
Mm-hmm.
said yes. And so when I showed up for lunch a week later, I showed him this report that was kind of like roughly around 20 pages or so. And this is when YouTube just started
Mm-hmm.
taking off. And he had a YouTube channel. And I showed him little bit of like tips and strategies to improve his YouTube channel and visibility. And he was so impressed that he wanted to hire me on the spot.
Oh
And
wow.
I said, wow, okay, well, I could potentially learn a lot from this guy. And this might be a once in a lifetime opportunity. So maybe I should go for this, because I knew I could always go back to school, right? This
Mm-hmm.
opportunity might not come after I'm done
What
with
does this
school.
guy do?
So he was a life coach in Los
Oh.
Angeles. And when I moved to the States, I grew up in the Netherlands. And when I
Mm-hmm.
moved to the States, I really didn't know anybody. So I was always interested in personal development, reading books, bettering myself, anything that I could do to kind of like change my circumstances. Because when my parents moved to the Netherlands, they started from nothing. Like we just
Mm-hmm.
had a suitcase, some diaper bags, and a briefcase, and that was it. And a few
Right.
$100s. And so we had to start from the bottom. And so I was always very motivated to change my circumstances. And my parents always instilled in me, I'm sure you've had very similar upbringing in the sense
Mm-hmm.
that, you have to go to school, you have to, become a doctor
Right.
or lawyer or attorney or a dentist,
Right.
and
That's
then
what
you're
I
going to
was
be fine.
doing. Pre-med.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like I was going to be on that path as well, but
Mm-hmm.
I decided to change my path. And
Mm-hmm.
so I was basically working under this guy for about a year and a half, and then um, ended up leaving the company and then traveling the world for a little bit. And so, as I was kind of like figuring out what my next move was going to be, I decided to start a blog to kind of share all the things I was learning from this guy, but also all the seminars and workshops I went through over the last few years. And just, started this website called AsianEfficiency.com, because people always kept asking me about productivity tips and
Mm-hmm.
strategies, and because I was learning a lot about that, and I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
always organized. I had to learn all these things myself. And when people started to notice how productive I was, they started asking me very similar questions all the time. So I said, you know what? Instead of writing the same email over and over again, I'm just going to start a blog for commonly asked questions that I get and just
Mm-hmm.
post them. And then anytime someone sends me a question, I would just say,
You
hey,
send
here's
them
a
the
link,
link. Yeah.
because I already wrote about it. And that's how the blog
Right.
got started. So
Uh-huh.
I said, you know what, I'm going to write for once a week for a whole year and then see where it goes. And then turns out that other people start discovering my website and found it really valuable. And then there was so much demand for it that people kept asking me, like, hey, Tan, like, I would love to hire you for coaching, or do you have a workshop? Do you have courses or
Oh
anything? And
wow.
I said, oh, no, like, this is just for fun, just for my friends and family. But people kept asking me for it, and people were just begging to give me money. And I was like, who am I to say not to take
Right.
this money? Right. So I said,
Yeah.
maybe I should turn this into a business. And now, 12 years later, here we are.
Okay, so what exactly do you do in your company? Is it more speaking gigs? Is it coaching? Is it all?
When we first started in 2011, first year, I didn't make any money because it was just a passion project. And then I had to figure out, how am I going to quote unquote monetize this, actually build a business around this. And so this is 2012. This is when blogging just started taking off, and like online courses were like the hot thing. They were like brand
Mm,
new. And so I said, you know what, I like that idea, but also like the idea of coaching. I like the idea of consulting. I like the idea of group coaching. So I've tried all sorts of different things like one-on-one coaching. I quickly found out that that wasn't really for me,
mm,
because I'm kind of introverted, and so I can't have too much like time like one on one with someone,
uh-huh.
especially if it's remote. And this is back in 2012 when Skype was like the way to do remote
Right,
calls.
right.
I don't know if people remember those days, but that wasn't very
They
great.
weren't as good, yeah.
Yeah, compared to what we have today. So
Mhm,
that was not like the way to go. And then I tried group coaching, but I was like, okay, this is all right, but not like super passionate. And
mhm,
then I kind of discovered the idea of like, okay, what if I had an online course where I shared something or recorded something one time and then shared it with everybody who wanted it. And that seemed to be more in alignment with how I wanted to do things. And
Mhm.
so, first probably 8, 9 years was mostly online courses. And then we expanded to doing live courses. So, not just pre recorded videos, but having live courses that we do remote. So, that's something we've been doing for the last 4 years or so. And then nowadays, we also have in person workshops now that things are
Mhm.
kind of like back to normal. And so, we do that now. And so we're kind of expanded from like online to pre-recorded to live online to now live in person.
Mhm.
So we do, I would say, 95% of that brings in kind of the bacon. And then the other small percentages, I work with maybe 3 or 4 clients a year, one on one, where they come to Austin, Texas, where I live, and we spend a day together, and then we continue remote with our coaching. And then we have a few other coaches who kind of do things as well, but that's a really small portion.
Mhm. So I think this would be a perfect transition question to what we were talking about earlier. You talked about your business and how it, slowly grew and you had to assess what your needs were, what solutions you're trying to attack versus, what is my skill set in this equation. Those are all important components, but your specialty here is productivity. And I want to ask, what advice do you have for someone that's, building on their own and they don't have the resource to have extra hands or extra time or extra energy even, right? So you're doing it all on your own. How did you manage to, grow that, and what were some productivity tips there?
Everybody that's starting a business is kind of like in that same
Yeah.
situation, right? Some have maybe better fortunate circumstances than others and better resources to kick things off. Like if you get funding right away, you have money. But if you don't have that, if you're like me, you had like a full-time job, and then you start something on the side, then you have to be very clear on your priorities and get really good at managing your time, because you and we have the same 24 hours in a day, but we get
Mhm.
to control and influence how we spend most of those hours, right? Now, obviously, we have to spend some time sleeping, we have to spend some time eating, we have to spend some time at our day job, but everything else in between is completely optional, right? So there were a lot of times when, for example, on the weekends, instead of me going out with friends, I said no. I said no. I said, I'm going to stay in so I can work on this side hustle that I
Mhm.
wanted to take off or have take off. And so there were a lot of times when, yes, I could have say yes to the birthday party or yes to happy hour or whatever. But I've made some tough decisions to say, what, for the short term, I'm going to say no a lot more often,
Mhm.
and create that time and space to focus on the side business or the side hustle that I wanted to grow and become my full-time income.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I don't know if this is the right thing to say, but like at my daytime job, anytime I had a break or if I like wasn't used or if I had some free time, I would be like, okay, what can I do in this time to grow
Right.
my side hustle? Whether it's some research, whether it's some email, and I would just, because I knew that was my number one priority, anytime I had idle time or something where I wasn't doing anything, my mind would just
Mhm.
immediately go, okay, what's
Go
the
there.
goal? Oh yeah.
Right.
And just go there and go, okay, what do I have to do right now? What can I do
Mhm.
to make progress? Like, and when you do that every single day, it really starts to add up, like 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, 30 minutes here, and before you know, you win an extra like 3 to 5 hours a week where you're working on your side hustle and your side project, right? And sometimes it's a little tricky because like sometimes you have tasks that require deep focus. So for
Mhm.
example, if you have to edit a podcast, it's kind of difficult to do that in like 15-minute increments,
And
when you have
yeah,
15-minute
right.
increments. But what you can do is in those 15-minute increments, like check your email, create some stuff on social or schedule some stuff so that you do all that stuff so that when you do have that block of time for an hour or two, then you can deeply focus on what needs to be done and you don't have to do all the other stuff that needs to be
Mhm.
done too. So you have to get really good at managing your time because again, we have the same number of hours, and so it's up to us to figure out like how can I get an extra hour and a half, 2 hours a day back to focus on my side hustle. And I think that's a really
Mhm.
good benchmark. If you can win like 90 minutes a day to build like your business, you can accomplish a lot because my business 12 years later now, it's grown substantially, but it started with 7 hour or 7.5 hours a week of just writing content, producing it, and then publishing it. And that
Right.
was built, this business that I have today was literally built in 7 hours a week in the first year of just publishing something.
Mhm.
So that is completely possible. Everybody can do that. That's 1 hour a day somewhere. And everyone can do that.
Mhm. Right. So I think, a problem because you talked about time management, and I think a problem for me, and I'm sure many others, because I've talked to a few people about this, is figuring out how much you can actually handle in a day. Right, biting off more than you can chew is something I like, almost on the daily is like, "Oh, I wanna get this, this, and this done," but you only get the first thing done, right? So or something like that, you just think you can do more. So how do you recalibrate your, ability to assess what you can accomplish in your time and day and hours?
Yeah, that's really tricky. So there's a framework that I teach at my programs called the T framework. And that's
Mhm.
kind of my own productivity methodology that I've created over the years. And it stands for time, energy, attention. So T. So when someone wants to become highly productive, they have to manage their time, they have to manage their energy, and they have to manage their attention. And ideally, we
Right.
want to maximize all three, right?
Mhm.
So if you're ever in a situation where um, you come home from work and you're like, okay, before you get home, as you're driving home, you kind of know already, like, oh, I want to work on this, I want to do that. Even before you actually go to the office, you already know, like, after I come home, I want to do all these things. And then when you come home and you go, oh, I'm tired. Like, you sit on the couch, you just want to watch Netflix, you're on Amazon Prime, you're just like chilling, catch up on some sports and social. You're just like, oh, just want to chill for a little
Right.
bit. Like, that's just a sign of lack of energy. So
Mhm.
if you have a lack of energy, it's just very difficult to do a lot of things or to take things off the ground, right?
Mhm.
Even if you have the time to do it, like, even when you come home at, let's say, 5 o'clock, and there's a block of time between, let's say, 5:30 and 7,
Mhm.
like, even if you have the time and space to do it, but if you have no energies, nothing will get done. It's kind of like having a sports car in your garage with no fuel in the
No
tank.
gas, yeah.
Like, it has so much potential, and the driver could be
Mhm.
super skilled and excited, but if it has no gas, like, it's just not going to go anywhere.
Right.
So it's the same thing for our own, like, bodies as well. Like, if we have no energy, nothing will get accomplished. So if you find yourself in that kind of situation, there's two things we can do, really. One is we can flip the schedule around, and to say, and this is what I found to be most effective with most clients, is instead of saying, what, I'm going to do all these things after work, when
Mhm.
it's kind of been shown that it's very difficult to do, what if you flip it around and say, hey, what if you wake up a little earlier, work
Mhm.
on your stuff first, and then go to your daytime job, right? So
Right.
then when you come home, like, you have nothing to worry about, like, you're kind of done and you're good to go. And then at least you got your stuff done because you got it done in the morning before you went to work.
Right.
So that's one approach I found very effective with most people. The other thing is, most of us suffer from a lack of sleep. And when we get an extra hour of sleep, oftentimes that results in like an hour or two of extra productivity.
Mhm.
So if you find yourself in that situation where you come home from work and you're kind of fatigued, what I would recommend is actually go to bed earlier. Because if you're not doing anything, just might as well go to bed earlier. Try to get an extra hour, hour and a half of sleep. And you'll start to notice after a week or two, when you're doing that, you have so much energy that when you come home from work, you're just like, all right, what's next? What do we need to do? What's
Right.
what's the number one priority? Okay, let's go ahead and do that. And so those are two things that you can influence and change and control, right? There's like how
Mhm.
much sleep you get, and then also what time you wake up. And so if we could do those two things together, even like getting more sleep and waking up earlier to start on our side hustle before we go to our day job, like, doing that for an hour a day, every single day, like, you're going to substantially grow your business way more than what you're probably currently doing right now.
Right. So essentially you want to maybe front load your energy while you have more, energy in the day. And then also you want to get some more sleep. That way you have that front loaded energy. What about for people that are struggling to like you said, right? You have to make sacrifices with your social life and everything. And people, it seems like everything's at night, right? So for your clients, did you have to tell them basically like you got to sacrifice your nights and your socials, at least, for the most part, to kind of have that front loaded energy?
Oh, yeah. Like, for example, when I did this, I told my clients when I still had my daytime job, I was like, hey, could we do this call at 7 o'clock at night? And they were like, okay, sure. you know, like, because
Right.
that's the only time I had available, right?
Hmm.
So we had to make things work that way from my perspective, but also for them, because sometimes they wouldn't be able to do it during their daytime job either. They had to do it,
Right.
outside of their own job hours. So that's one thing. But also, when it comes to saying no, when you are so clear about what you want, it's really easy to say no to stuff. But if
Hmm.
you're unclear about what you want, then you're probably going to end up saying yes to most things. So, for
Hmm.
example, if your number one goal is to like look like a fitness model, and it's like your top priority is like your health and fitness, and you want to make it to like a magazine cover of a fitness
Hmm.
magazine or something. If someone says, hey Shiva, do you want to have this piece of cheesecake right now? Like, I'm gonna have some. Do you want some?
Right. And you'd be like,
You just
no,
go, no, like that doesn't
no.
align with what I want to accomplish at all. Like,
Hmm.
so it's really easy to say no to that, right? Whereas, like, if you're just kind of like going with the flow, you just kind of living life, like cheesecake. Oh, that sounds pretty good, actually. You know what? I'll have some. And so when we don't know what we want and we're not clear on our top priorities, it's so easy to say yes to everything because we don't want to feel like we're missing out. We want to kind of enjoy
Hmm.
life. We're just like living in a moment, right? But when we are clear about the future and what we're trying to accomplish, we can make short-term sacrifices by saying, for example, no to the short-term pleasure of eating this cheesecake because there's something bigger behind that we're aiming for. That might be like a month away, 2 months away, it could be 2 years away, right? But we're saying no to stuff now, and giving up a lot of things in the short term to get the long term benefit over time, right? So I was able to say no to a lot of like happy hours and parties, and say like, what, I'm gonna miss out. Like, when I see those photos or the stories the next day, I'm just like, okay, I wasn't there, but guess what? In a few years from now, I'm gonna be doing all that and even more fun and better. And I'm gonna have the freedom and flexibility to do all that stuff, right? So
Right.
I'm sacrificing what's going on now to do it in the future, and that can really only be done if you have a clear vision and a clear priority of what you want. And so if you're listening to this and you don't know what that is, that's the first thing you have to figure out.
Hmm. You have to have a clear why. It's not a motivator, a driver.
Yeah, like a vision, and then the motivation or the why, like you're saying, behind it as well, right? Like if you're just saying, "Hey, I want to get on the cover of a fitness magazine,"
Right.
that's like a vision. But what's the underlying motivation behind it, like the why
Hmm.
behind it, right? And that could be different for everybody. It could be purely ego. It could be like, hey, I just want to be famous, and that could be your motivation. But it could also be like you walking away from pain and say, hey, you know what, I used to be really overweight, and for
Hmm.
me, like if I make it to the cover, that's a sense of accomplishment, right?
Hmm.
And that's when you're kind of made it or you're done.
Right.
So everyone's motivation is going to be different, obviously, but the outcome is easy to envision sometimes. Like this is what it should look like, but oftentimes the motivating aspect of it is something that we don't really know. And
Hmm.
so if you're coming home and you're like, oh yeah, I want to be on the front cover of this magazine, sometimes that's not motivating enough to go, oh yeah, I should get my butt off this couch and go to the gym.
Right.
But then if you go, oh, you know what? I want to show these other people that I made it. Like that
Hmm.
sometimes, even though it's kind of like the dark side of motivation, sometimes that's what really fuels people.
Hmm. Yeah, I think with motivation, it can it doesn't have to be perfect. And I think I've actually even noticed this myself is sometimes your motivations change, right? You started something for one reason and then you grew it for a different reason. So so motivation can be found in a lot of ways, but I think I hear a lot of people talk about vision as well. And vision, I feel like, is a very um, at least difficult concept for me to quite grasp when just because I think, maybe other people feel this way, but there's an abundance of opportunities and doors that you can choose from, paths you can take to the point where it's almost overwhelming to say that like, okay, this is what I want to do, right? It's very difficult to just stick to something or kind of know yourself. What are some advice you have for people that are, looking for their why or what they want?
Yeah, there's a lot of great books that I would always recommend that people read. So, another way of saying this is, to me, self awareness is like the ultimate productivity hack. If you really understand yourself, then you know how to get the best out of yourself. But the problem is, we can't, or it's very difficult to figure out what motivates us from just like doing like the internal work. Sometimes we have to have an external person or some external resources or information to help us kind of discover what those things might be, right? So, for example, a really simple thing you could do is I'm sure everyone has taken a personality test at one point, whether it's Myers Briggs, DISC, Strength Finder. Like, there's all of these things, and then when you read them, you go, "Oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. Like, that's really me." Right.
Mhm.
Even though you kind of knew it already, like you had
Right.
to take an external test to really understand yourself. And that's my whole point, which is it's kind of like if you're like inside of a jar, you can't read the ingredients label, right? Because the
Yeah.
ingredients label is on the outside, even though when you're inside of it, like that's you as a person, but you can't read it from the outside,
Right.
even though it's saying exactly what it's made of and who it is and what it is
Right.
and so on. And so sometimes we need to be able to step outside and go, what is the ingredient label on me? Like, what am I made of? What do I believe in? And that's kind of difficult to do when you're on the inside. And so we need like external help sometimes, like a personality test, a coach, reading books so that you can kind of get a sense of what those labels might look like. And so I'd say those three things are probably the most influential. Personality tests, there's so many of them. I would say whichever one you pick the one that resonates most with you, and then really study it. Because after a while, you start to notice most of them are kind of the same,
Mhm.
because they kind of rely on the same brain tendencies and dopamine and
Right.
hits. And so what you'll start to realize is if you just study one really well, then you'll have a good sense of like who you are as a person. And then you'll start to, go deeper into what are your values? What is important to you? How do you align with your time and your values at the same time? So for example, if your number one value is family, like, or family time, but your number one activity on your calendar, according to the time allocation, is working, like there's a misalignment there, right? Like if you're saying that family is so important to you, but you spend 90% of your time working at the office, like we're out of alignment there. Like ideally, what is most important to us is also what we spend most of our time and money on, right? So I can look at someone's calendar and credit card statement and be like, I can roughly figure out what your most important values are based on how you spent your time and how you spent your money. But if they don't align with what you think is most important, then we always end up with friction in our life, right? So, for example, I thought my number one value was family, but I spent most of my time working, and I always felt like something is off in my life. Like I'm, missing out on Thanksgiving. I'm missing out on all these holidays. I'm kind of upset about it, but at the same time, I was like, like I'm working all the time. Like, what do I do? And then that's when I realized, oh, actually, family is important, but it's actually not my number one priority at all. My number one priority is actually freedom. And once I realized that, that's when I went, okay, now I understand why I make these sacrifices, and I'm okay with them because I'm working towards my number one value, which is freedom or flexibility, right? And so, like reading books, like anything by Simon Sinek, I think is a great resource. He's great. Start with Why is a real simple book to get started with. Um, there's another one called The Power of Story by Jim Lohr, Loehr. Um, and that's really about finding your purpose. And then he does it by giving you prompts and exercises to do. And then you'll kind of get a sense of what your purpose is. And Other things I find really helpful is just Strength Finder, which is like a personality test. Where if you read the book, then you'll kind of get a sense as well. And that's again all under the umbrella of like how do we build self awareness? Because once we get a sense of our own tendencies and how we operate, then we'll start to notice all the things that kind of make sense for us and not make sense for others. So, for example, you know, in productivity, there's this common advice of like, oh, you have to wake up early to be productive. But then when you work with clients in the real world, you start to realize not everybody likes waking up early.
Oh,
Some
yeah,
people are
right.
like legitimate night owls. There's a chronotype called specifically for people who tend to have the most energy late at night. So telling a person to wake up at 5 a.m. when they feel their best at like 11 o'clock at night, it makes absolutely no sense, right?
Right.
And so, even though that advice is quote unquote good, when you understand yourself and how you operate, you can take that advice and go, okay, that really applies to me and that works well. Or say, hey, actually, that's not for me at all. I like the idea of like prioritizing my time, but that doesn't work in the way that I live. So I have to change that.
I liked a couple points you mentioned, one about the dopamine and how it affects your brain, right? I actually learned this recently about, and I'm sure you'll appreciate this, is you've probably looked into the dopamine effects of, and how that affects productivity as well, because the dopamine system is huge in the productivity space. Because if you can learn how that works, then kind of it all starts to make sense, right? But where I was getting with that is I learned that, we live in this go, go, go society. We're always doing something next. Go do this, check it off, dopamine hit. But the other part of the brain, which is also part of the dopamine system, is the no go portion where you show self restraint. It's where you show discipline. It's where you say no to things, right? And if you constantly live in this go, 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 or just say yes, you really kind of mess with your dopamine system where you can't even like have that attention, like you said, energy, time, and attention. You don't have that ability to give it attention anymore because you're just kind of just so numb from doing the yes all the time that you just can't even get yourself to say, like, no, I'm going to go do this. So I thought that was really interesting in relation to what you were saying.
Yeah, there's this popular mantra that's life is a marathon, right? I'm sure you've heard that before. Like,
Yeah.
hey, whatever happens in the short term, don't worry about it, just keep going, right? And I like that idea, but what I would actually maybe tweak it to would be based on my experience is that life is a series of sprints. So it's not like you go at one pace and just keep going at towards the destination or finish line. Um, I like that message of like, hey, whatever's happening in the short term, it's okay, just keep going.
Hmm.
But like you were saying, when I think of life as a series of sprints where you're engaging, you're going all out,
Hmm.
then when we do that, we have to like catch our breath at the end of a sprint, recover before we can actually sprint again. Like there's just no way to sprint, for five
Yeah.
minutes straight. Like you're done after like 30 seconds, like.
Right.
And so life and performance, especially when it comes to productivity, is very much like that. Like we work in the daytime, we give it all, maybe our all, and then at night we have to sleep to recover so we can do it again the next day, right?
Hmm.
Just like when we play a sport, we might have to give it our all for 60 minutes, 90 minutes, and then after that we have to recover before we can actually do it again. And
Right.
so when I think about performance at work, it's very much the same thing. Like we have to take care of ourselves, like our sleep, our health, so that we can recover. So that
Hmm.
when we do show up at work or at the office or when we're kicking off our side hustle outside of office hours, if we take care of ourselves, then we have the energy to perform when we have to, right? And
Right.
that's how I see it as a series of sprints. It's like you engage, you focus, you do your thing. Once you're done, relax, recover, so that you can do it again and be all out. And then that way, when you're fully engaged, that's how you focus. That's how you can be really creative. Because if we're constantly distracted, it's very
Yeah.
difficult to create some of our best work possible. And so we have to be fully present and engaged. And that's how I see it as like a series of sprints.
I actually think it's really interesting if we look at creativity versus productivity. I actually think creativity follows a little slightly different framework. because you're not necessarily needing full 100% deep focus energy, but the creativity process comes about in weird ways sometimes. Maybe you're just completely tired at night and you're like, "Wait, what about this idea?" Or you're in the shower. I think some people, say that showers are their space. For me, I like to go on like leisure drives. Something I think what it is something that kind of puts you in an autopilot state or like a state of like, calmness, tiredness in a way. I do think, I don't know, at least that's what I've noticed in creativity processes. Oftentimes, when you have a little bit of tiredness or you're relaxed, that's when you kinda have some of your best ideas.
Yeah, it's almost like the opposite of
Yeah.
focus, right? So, like,
Right.
the analogy I always like to use with people is when you see a poet looking at the window from an outsider perspective, it might seem like that poet is doing nothing. It's just staring out the window.
Right.
But from a poet's point of view, the poet is like thinking, ideating, looking for inspiration, letting creative ideas kind of brew while this
Right.
poet is looking at the window. There's actually a lot happening, but it's not
Right.
like, intense focus or actually doing manual work. But from an outsider, everyone's like, what is this poet doing? It's just sitting there
Right.
looking at the window, doing absolutely nothing. But that's what we need, though, if we want to be really creative, right?
Mhm.
And so we have to create the time and space to be able to do that. Like that poet wouldn't be able to do it if he knew that he had a call in 2 minutes. He would probably be thinking about whatever's on the call if he had a call in
Right.
2 minutes or even 15 minutes rather than, you know, if I had an afternoon off and I didn't have any pressing deadlines or anything, then yes, it's easy to let my mind wander, look out the window and then let an idea just ideate, kind of brew and deconstruct and reconstruct. But we have to create the time and space for us to do that, right? And so, yes, we can wait for the lucky shower moments, right? But we can also be intentional about it and say, hey, you know
Mhm.
what? Like I did this like 2 weeks ago. I went on a trip out in Hill Country, which is like maybe an hour outside Austin, Texas, where it's beautiful nature. I went to rent a cabin for 2 nights and no internet, no social media whatsoever. It was just me, a
Mm.
bunch of groceries, and a bunch of books, right?
It's like, Bill Gates' Think Week.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
And it was very much inspired by Bill Gates's Think Week. And so when I was doing that, and I do this every quarter, I have so many ideas. Like my notebook is every time I come back, my
Oh, that's
notebook is
awesome.
full of ideas of things I want to do, things I
Right.
should stop doing, things I want to like expand upon, things I want to research, more later on, interests that I have that I maybe revived or kind of lost and want to get back into. Like there was just so much happening inside of my brain, but I needed the time and space to create it. And so I have to like leave the city to go into nature
Right.
to be able to actually let it ideate for like 2 days, right?
Mhm.
But we can do this in an afternoon as well. Like there's different ways of doing it. All of this is to say we can be intentional about it and let creativity foster if we create the environment around it to let it, appear.
Right. It's just so interesting that it almost seems like the exact opposite, right? You kinda like you said, you just gotta give yourself that time and space to allow the thoughts to flow and almost in a way that's kind of, related back to what we're talking about, and I think people are always in this society where we gotta go do the next thing, check off, check off, check off, right? Like, gotta hit that list, but, creativity can be just as important because, for example, let's say you're doing the same task every day, that's difficult, but if you gave yourself a few hours, one day you might have a thought that's, "Wait, why don't I do it like this and save myself," like, for example, for you, maybe who knows, maybe you had a creative moment and then you thought, "Wait, why don't I just start a blog and send people links? That would save me so many hours of text, emails, and calls," right? So, just stuff like that. So, I think creativity is super important, but an often neglected subject in productivity.
Absolutely. Absolutely agree with that. Yep.
Mhm. So then I wanted to ask you if you had anything else you wanted to mention on this podcast. If not, I always ask my guests, what is one thing that either you learned from or you want others to learn from you? Some advice you could give.
Oh, that's a great question. I would say, as my final takeaway for today's episode, one thing I just found really helpful is the T framework that I've
Mm,
created over the years to figure out where someone needs the most help when it comes to productivity. So if you're feeling like you're not as productive as you could be, you're maybe stuck, you feeling like you have a lot more potential, but it's not being unlocked. The T framework is super helpful with that. Like, are you not having enough time in your life? Are you not having enough energy? Or are you not focusing in the right areas, which is attention?
mm,
And if you know that one of those areas needs the most attention, then as a next step is, I would say, just focus on that particular area. Like if you're lacking time in your life right now, like go do some research on what you can do to find back time in your life that allow you to do the things that you want to do, right? Or if
right.
you're
Or
lacking
like
energy in your
automate
life,
like you did.
or automate. Yeah, yeah, that's more advanced.
Yeah.
Um,
All right.
but the idea is the same, right? Which is like if we want to focus on time, like how do we get that back? And so there's tons of resources. I have tons of it on my website, asianefficiency.com. I also have a podcast called The Productivity Show where people can kind of go and listen to new episodes every week on productivity tips and strategies. And so there's tons of free resources for people to go check out there. But also just use the T framework. Just diagnose yourself like, is it time, energy, or intention? And
Mm,
then let that rabbit hole kind of focus going down that hill from there.
right. And we didn't really touch on this that much, but when you mentioned with attention and realigning what your priorities were, I thought that was really important. And because I read this book by Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning. And the key takeaway I got from that book was he talked about it was his experience in the Auschwitz internment camp. And he was explaining, you know, he assigned meaning to his suffering, and that made all the difference, right? And maybe, not so extreme senses for you, like suffering is a very extreme word, maybe not in a sense suffering, but you said that, you had this disconnect, you felt some sort of discomfort that you didn't feel like what you were doing was aligning with what you wanted. And in a way that is slight suffering because you're like, well, why am I doing this if this isn't what I want? Right. So then you realigned what your meaning was and it's freedom. And then you gave that real purpose to it. And really clicked for me when you said that. So that was really important.
Yeah, that's a great example. And that's a book I've read like 12 years ago. It's such a classic for
Hmm.
anyone who hasn't read it yet. I think it's a must read for anybody.
It's a good book. Yeah. Well, I'll also have all your information, the books you mentioned, your website, and everything in the podcast description. So, guys, if you want to, check him out, if you liked his advice and you want to see more, you do coaching, right? Or not so much anymore?
Yeah, still offer coaching. So if anybody wants to be more productive and wants one-on-one coaching, we definitely offer that now too.
Okay, sweet. Thank you, then, for being here, and thank you, everyone, for listening.